Welcome to this fourth in our series of community conversations on compassion. The topic this evening is compassion and town government. And with us to help us consider that and to have a community conversation, we have Brandy Starr from the Select Board, the chair of the Select Board, Peter Elwell, town manager, and Chief Michael Fitzgerald from the police department. This series is brought to the community by Compassionate Brattleboro, which is a group of area residents who are working together with the following mission: to raise community awareness about the meaning of compassion in our lives and ways in which compassion can influence the town's government, the organizations and institutions within the town, and most important, among the town's citizens in our daily lives and interactions with others. If you would like to be part of the work of Compassionate Brattleboro, there are a couple of sign-up sheets in the back. If you leave your name and a way to contact you, then we'll let you know. We will encourage you to come and be part of the work. The reason why Compassionate Brattleboro is functioning at this point is because of the will and the expressed voice of the voters, the citizens of the town of Brattleboro. I would like to read a resolution for compassion in Brattleboro, which is dated the 2nd of May, 2017. And this is signed by the Select Board. Whereas an international charter for compassion was created in 2009, and whereas, among other things, the Charter for Compassion affirms the inviolable sanctity of every human being, calls upon all people to treat each other with absolute justice, equity, and respect, and states that we urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. And whereas the Brattleboro Area Interfaith Initiative is organizing local action that is consistent with the Charter for Compassion and has urged the town government to join in these efforts. And whereas on March 7th, 2017, Brattleboro voters overwhelmingly approved by 83% in favor the following town meeting article: shall the town of Brattleboro vote to advise the Select Board to become a compassionate city, as articulated in the Charter for Compassion? And whereas the Brattleboro Select Board desires to join the local compassion movement, now therefore the Brattleboro Select Board hereby resolves and proclaims that the town of Brattleboro is committed to the principles expressed in the Charter for Compassion, supports the collaboration of local individuals and organizations to promote those principles through a variety of public and private actions in our community, will remain mindful of the impacts of our actions not only in Brattleboro, but upon people and places beyond our borders, and invites all people to observe and participate in town government and to hold town government officials accountable for conducting our local public business in a manner that is consistent with this resolution. The Charter for Compassion was formulated by Karen Armstrong, a religious scholar, written widely on world religions. And she noticed that the golden rule in one form or another is a part of religions all around the world, and it seems to be almost a universal human understanding that it is admirable to do unto others as we would have them act toward us. This reciprocity. But she also noticed that different cultures understand it differently. And while the Charter for Compassion, the intent is to be global, universal, all people everywhere in the world, that the way compassion is understood and practiced is going to look different in different places. And part of what we're trying to do is to understand what does it look like in Brattleboro in 2019. How do we understand it? How do we live it? How do we talk about it? So, Peter, why don't you start and tell us something about how you understand compassion, about what it is and what it looks like in our town.
Thank you, Doug, and good evening, everyone. I've always thought it was interesting that the Golden Rule asks us to do unto others as we want them to do unto us. I think actually that's important, that we start there, but that compassionate action actually involves something that's a little harder most of the time, which is to try to understand how a person that we're interacting with wishes to be treated. So it's not necessarily true that each person wants to be treated the way I want to be treated. And it's important for us as we do, particularly, I believe, I'll plead guilty to probably making some comments tonight that those of you who aren't directly involved in government work may find insufficiently appreciative of all the other many ways in which people serve each other. I chose to do this as a career because of the fact that it involves serving a wide variety of people to the best of my ability in ways that, you know, together we can address the issues of our community or subsections of our community. And from the very start, that it was apparent to me that it was important to, I guess, using more modern terminology than we were using back in the 1980s, meet people where they are. And so in a community, even one that's small as Brattleboro at 12,000 people, we come from so many different perspectives. And different folks have different intellectual abilities, different folks have different priorities, people have different financial wherewithal and different concerns for their family or their neighborhood. And we deal with all those different things in town government. And so for me and for the team of people with whom I work every day in service to the community, what compassion means to us is being sure that we're paying attention to all the different concerns and aspirations that we're seeing and hearing from people in the community without undue regard to sort of in the first instance what seems feasible or what seems important, but to be listening and be engaged sufficiently that we're facilitating a process where the people of the town who choose to be involved in their government get an opportunity to be equally impactful on the things that we do. And that doesn't mean that everybody ends up equally happy at the end of the processes, but hopefully the processes are inclusive enough that people feel heard and don't feel excluded from the operation of their town government.
Chief Fitzgerald, what does compassion look like, or what does it mean to you, and how do you experience it in your day-to-day work in the town?
I think that's why everybody's here, is to hear what the police department, what their definition of compassion is. And hopefully when you leave tonight, you'll have a really good understanding on my philosophy in policing and my understanding on how the Brattleboro Police Department serves the members of their community. I hope you really listened to the resolution that was written, because I'm very proud to say that 3 years prior to that resolution, we did an assessment at the Brattleboro Police Department. And part of that assessment was I charged the supervisors and the managers of the different non-sworn departments to take a step back and look at the police department, and how does the citizens of Brattleboro want to be policed? And we did that. We did a very in-depth assessment, which lasted a good 6 to 8 months long, of everything from nuts to bolts, A to Z. And within that, we revamped our mission statement. And I wanted our mission statement to reflect our philosophy in policing. If you look at a lot of police departments' mission statements, you'll find they're cookie cutter. You'll probably see a lot of protect and serve, enforce the law, and things of that nature. They're very short and sweet. They're acceptable mission statements, but there wasn't the mission statement I wanted. And our mission statement basically was done by our officers, not me. I didn't come up with this mission statement and give it to them and say, this is what we're going to do. They came to me, which is I'm very, very proud of, and said, Chief, this is what we want on our mission statement. And pretty much it says we are going to police our community in a manner worthy of respect. While serving the community, we're going to recognize the differences of the conduct of people who need our help, those who make poor decisions, and those who choose to victimize others. That's how we police Brattleboro, okay? So when we go to a call, what that officer is looking at and the questions that they're going to ask themselves is, what am I dealing with here? Am I dealing with an individual who needs my help? Am I dealing with an individual who made a poor decision? Or am I dealing with an individual who chooses to victimize others? And they will act accordingly on that. Let's take a step forward. Now, this was back in 2014 when we did this, so a good 3 years before that resolution was written and before Compassion was cool. We were blazing the trail on that. Now, officers having compassion and empathy to the citizens they serve is absolutely essential for successful law enforcement. Empathy is not only understanding someone else's feelings, but to share in those feelings. And compassion picks up where empathy leaves off. If empathy is the understanding of another's feelings, then compassion is putting that understanding into action. Defining compassion should be very familiar if you, or similar I should say, if you ask me to describe a police officer. What is my description of a police officer? And that is, compassion is a willingness to assist others at an emotional level that selflessly puts the needs of others before the needs of your own without expecting anything in return. That's the police officers I want in our department, and those are the police officers I want to serve the community of Brattleboro. Treating individuals with compassion, whether they be victims, witnesses, or suspects, it helps to build rapport. It starts the healing process for situations that are more times than not unpleasant, dangerous, traumatic. It's just, sometimes we deal with some pretty tough situations. And compassion is absolutely the most important attribute for a law enforcement officer when dealing with citizens of the community. And finally, if officers cannot or will not serve with compassion and respect, they're ineffective and they become a liability to whatever agency they work for. So that's a real quick, in a nutshell, how we at the Brattleboro Police Department view compassion and how we use that in our daily interactions with the citizens.
Thank you, Chief. Brandy.
Hi.
So how does the concept of compassion fit into your view of the town and your role in the select board?
So I find that compassion is something and empathy is something that often can come when you've walked in shoes that are similar to shoes that not everybody has walked in. I have the blessing of having lived a pretty hard life, and having assimilated very well to the mainstream. And so I see my role on the select board as kind of an educational bridge between people who understand and live every day in hardships and people who maybe haven't had that experience yet. It's very important to me to do my best to really describe to people, outside of, sound bites and kind of judgmental rhetoric, what it's like to be another person and what we can do and how I hope they're on board with being able to help. It can be challenging being in town government and trying to use compassion for some, because that's not how municipality governments were often known. They were the people like, we don't take care of emotions, we fix the sidewalks and deal with the tax rates, and we assume other organizations do other stuff and things for other people. But it's really become important, and should have always been important, that people who are leaders in the town can take a look at the whole picture of who lives in the town and make sure that every part of the town is being served. And for some people, having decent roads and a good sidewalk is about enough, and they can pretty much manage the rest of their lives on their own. They have that privilege and they have that opportunity. But for other people, that's not the case. And it can be scary in town government to think about having to stretch the arm of the municipality out towards helping people that are in harder situations. It's not a common role, but it is an imperative role, and it's a role that I certainly strive to do in my work and conversations on the board.
So, Brandy, I think you bring up an interesting idea. One of the things that people universally, I think, rate very highly or care very much about is fairness, and that we be treated fairly. And our Constitution and the laws under which we operate and that you operate as a government have to do with fairness, treating people equally. When does compassion run into treating people equally? Is there a place in which being compassionate means that you actually treat people unequally, and is that appropriate for town government?
This question for me.
Yes.
Okay.
So I went to I think it was a training that we did last year, and the person that gave the training said, fair does not mean same, and equitable does not mean equal. And so yes, bringing compassion into an environment of systems such as a municipality is going to end up making things not same and not equal. In the process of bringing equitable service to those who have gone without for generations, it's going to feel like we're spending extra time with one group of people. And that feeling is true. We are indeed having to do that. And I'm always happy to explain why, and why I stand on that side of it, and why I'm okay with that. My compassion extends to everybody. One thing that I really try to do throughout the year is make sure that I am in some way supporting each sector of the town. Am I giving support to downtown businesses? Am I taking a look at tax relief? Am I looking at ways to make sure that those who are having to fly a sign, are having their rights protected as well? I want to touch everybody, but I'm going to touch people that have gone too long without a hand to hold a little bit more. And I'm comfortable with that.
I think it's important. I think it's important for us to recognize that on this point of unequal outcomes, that unequal outcomes are nothing new. Acknowledging them and being conscious about how we make decisions and how our outcomes are hopefully equitable, even though not equal, is essential to actually good governance. This evening we're talking about it in terms of compassion, and I think it squarely fits together. But I think just in terms of public officials doing their jobs in a responsible, appropriate manner for and with a community, choices have to be made. And choices are going to be made either in ways that are sort of relatively more random, or in structured ways that respect power and influence and access more than respecting other things. And we make a really conscious effort here in Brattleboro, and I've had the opportunity to work in 4 other jurisdictions, in 3 other states. We got a good thing going here. It's a community that pays attention and stays engaged, holds us accountable, and at this time, with this team, there is very strong shared commitment to doing our work in a way that encourages less heard voices to be heard, encourages action that, frankly, I mean, it's not a surprise to anybody in this room. It's not a surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to town government for these last few years. If we think about flying a sign, we've had numerous meetings, select board meetings about that, where we've heard from people in the community, and there are concerns and that people in our community have about certain locations particularly, and certain activities in the downtown area, and a sense of fear that some people have. And it's been important for us to be able to listen to everyone, to hear those words too, and then to, as respectfully as we can, speak the truth that Brandy was just articulating about the importance of us as a community not marginalizing people who are struggling. And so we continue to this day to interact with folks in the community using standards that aren't always exactly the words that the chief used. Those are the words that provide really good, clear guidance and for police officers differentiating among different situations in the street. But more broadly than that in town government, I would suggest that we ask people who express those kinds of concerns to us, you know, downtown feels different, I don't like walking down a certain block, those sorts of things. Are you talking about something that has actually threatened your safety, or are you talking about something you'd rather not see? And if you're just talking about something you'd rather not see, you're entitled to that opinion, but town government isn't going to act on that concern. If you feel unsafe, if there's an action going on where you see someone who's hurting someone else or threatening someone else, call 911. Get a police officer on the scene so that everybody's rights and safety can be protected. But if it's just a matter of, you know, I'd rather not see so many cardboard signs downtown, then we're sorry that that disturbs you. But what we're going to do is continue to work as a community to respect the rights of individuals to be on our streets, all individuals to be on our streets, and to collaborate with people in the community as effectively as we can and as compassionately as we can to address those problems. It's a long haul. It's a set of systemic issues driven in many ways from influences outside of Brattleboro. Economic influences, the opioid influences. We're nowhere near solutions that will cause us to be able to look back on these days. We're very much in the midst of these days, but as we are in the midst of these days, we're going to be addressing those sorts of things in a way that keeps people included and engaged in the conversation, but is not, doesn't create a situation where anybody is characterized as those people.
I agree with everything Brandy and Peter has said, and sometimes our officers are put in a very difficult situation. And we have to balance the fears or perception of fears with individuals against what is constitutionally protected, if a law was broken or not. And we can have quite a few balls juggled in the air at the time. Obviously, we're always going to fall back on, was a crime committed? And if there was no crime committed, then, you know, our actions, once again, take off a different avenue. Whereas we would talk to people, all parties involved, basically find out why were we called and what can we do. Another thing that, not just in the downtown area, but no matter where we go, if an arrest was made, I would like to go back to our mission statement. And by going back to our mission statement is people are still going to be held accountable for their criminal actions. I want to make that perfectly clear. Okay, you can have all the empathy in the world, all the compassion in the world, but still hold people accountable for their actions. Okay, we're not marshmallows, we're not giving people a free pass. People are still held accountable. However, the fork in the road and how we differ is, how are you being held accountable? For far too long, the only option and the only solution was a cage. We would incarcerate them, and that was it. We were spinning our wheels, and we were solving absolutely nothing. Because as soon as those individuals were released back into the community, they didn't attend any type of counseling, any type of rehab, and they just went right back to the activities that got them in jail. And law enforcement was extremely frustrated because we were encountering and rearresting these same people time and time and time again. So, what do we do now? You're still being held accountable, but in what way? Okay? If you need to go to rehab, go to rehab. Okay? You need to get into rehab. If you have to be court ordered to go to rehab, I'm all for that. Okay? Get you into rehab. If you need any type of assistance, restorative justice is a phenomenal program. Get individuals together to sit down and talk and say, look at what you did. This is how it affected me. This is what it did to me. You know, you have restitution. There's a lot of ways that people can be held accountable. The bottom line is we want to make sure that we address the behavior that we went there first. Let's fix that. Let's get to the root of the problem. And we do that. That is our version or form, if you will, for lack of better words, on how we respond to things that are criminal in nature and how we respond compassionately by looking at the whole situation, not just the act alone, and that's it.
Each of us in our answers has been focused more on sort of the lives of individuals and how the government interacts with the lives of individuals. I want to, at the risk of being the bureaucrat on the panel, talk for just a second about how policy decisions get made in the select board's meeting room. Because at the end of the day, that is where, you know, the broad guidance is provided to town government about you know, our priorities and what we spend money on and where we invest our time and efforts, aside from just the basic functions of day-to-day infrastructure management and so on. But when we talk about, you know, what are we going to work on as a community, those decisions get made as a municipal government. Those decisions get made, that leadership is provided by the select board. And it's how people are invited to and enabled to participate in the decision-making that determines whether or not our processes are open and fair. And so I want to stress that we can't always have outcomes that don't end up with people feeling like winners and losers. We often, I think, actually have outcomes where people feel like winners and losers because there have been people advocating for something, people encouraging us not to do it, and then a decision has to be made and it gets made, and folks, at least in the moment, feel like they're leaving either successful or unsuccessful. I'd like to suggest two things about that. One is that we really try hard when we can to frame issues in ways that are more complicated than that. Where we try to be broader than just binary decisions, but look at how we're dealing with an issue and what the range of options look like in dealing with that issue, and sort of, again, encourage participation and creativity so that we can think beyond what we've just ourselves brought into the discussion. And that works sometimes so that there can be a greater feeling of collective creation of the result. But sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we still end up with an outcome where there are people feeling like winners and losers, even frankly within the dais. Sometimes, it's not that the select board, the 5 members of the board agree on everything. It's not that the board and the staff always agree on everything. So as we work through those issues, one of the most important things we can do in town government is be mindful of the impact at those moments of what happens next for the people who felt like they lost. And that isn't about us paying attention to folks who maybe have been less visible to us in the past, or showing compassion for those who have not had as much opportunity or privilege as many of us have had. That's actually just about no matter who you are and where you are and what socioeconomic status you have and what you bring into a conversation. You might end up being the winner or the loser in a given issue. And it's really important for us as we move from issue to issue, as we manage the different affairs of town government, to pay attention to the ways in which folks who don't get their way can still shape some of the outcome of where we go with an issue. And if we can't do that, if we can't have folks feeling accepting of an outcome, at least make sure we're paying attention to not having the negative impacts, the downside impacts of this thing that we had to decide, because sometimes we just have to decide. Make sure that we're mindful of how that's going to impact people. There's a real life example that I'd like to share that make this more understandable and so conceptual. And it had to do with when we went to every other week garbage collection, right? As a community, we had done fabulously well with our conversion to pay-as-you-throw. And we were doing so much diversion of solid waste into composting and recycling that our volume of garbage was way down. And the cost of providing the service was going up because we weren't selling enough bags to carry the cost of the service that we were providing. And that was actually a great thing. That was an unintended consequence of the decision, but it was a great thing. And we looked at a variety of different ways in which we might adjust for that. We have, in fact, been paying more money out of taxes into the solid waste program to offset the lost bag revenue. But the other thing we did was change to every other week garbage collection because there's so much less garbage to collect. And that is saving, collectively, the people of Brattleboro $100,000 a year. Actually, that was what it was in the first year, so we're doing better than that these days. So on balance, in the fullness of considering that, I think that the board made the right decision. It's easy for me to think that because staff recommended that to the board. The board had some hard conversations about it, heard some hard things from the community about it, but ultimately weighed all of that and said, yeah, I think we need to do this. And so for the last few years, we've had every other week collection. But there are some people in the community who are more negatively affected by that than others. So those who have less space in which they live have to store garbage for longer. Those who have small children in their household have diapers, and summertime collection of 2 weeks worth of diapers. It's not that pleasant. So there are downside impacts, and we have struggled in that in that particular situation to adequately address all the concerns that have been raised. But still, on balance, we've listened to everybody's concerns. We've respectfully talked about why we think, even notwithstanding that inconvenience, it's the better decision for the community broadly defined to have done what we've done. But just this afternoon, the reason I'm sharing this with you is just this afternoon I was reminded by a young parent that it's getting warmer. And the winter isn't so bad for collecting 2 weeks worth of diapers, but the heat of the summer is. And that caused me to reflect again that, it's been a while since we looked at that. And maybe we need to take a fresh look at, is there something we can do that offers some kind of relief to folks for whom the every other week doesn't work. It doesn't mean that we did the wrong thing, and it doesn't mean that we should go back to weekly collection, but maybe there's something more we can do.
So I'm impressed at the understanding and the caring and the heartfelt connection that you are putting into serving our community. If we are successful in making Brattleboro a more compassionate community than it already is, in what ways would that make your work easier or harder? And perhaps related to that, I'm sure that you find that there are limits to what you are able to do, that you would like to be able to be more compassionate. And is there anything that we can do, that the public in Brattleboro can do to allow you to be more compassionate in your work?
There's always two sides to a coin. So what could make it easier to do my work? Having a community that tends to be compassionate and see the whole of the community is going to make it easier for me to bring up ideas that might be out of the box for municipalities to think about. It might be something that's never been thought about in the context of town government. One of the challenges could be that if we're all super compassionate, which I want us to be, that can be expensive. So how are we looking at the budget? How are we balancing it out? How are we not slamming the burden of our compassion directly on the backs of the people from whom we want that compassion? One of my favorite things to do is, I kind of have made this up. This is not necessarily how the year works, but in my mind, how the year works is we have town meeting in March, and then in the beginning of the year, everybody comes forward with their big, out-of-the-box, compassionate, forward-thinking ideas. And then in my head, I like that to stop in September, and then we start the budget process. And why I get so excited about that is it brings it allows us to expand our horizons, to see what kind of ideas we have in the community that are compassionate and forward-thinking and smart and creative, and then narrow our focus back down to what we can actually do. And that's really important, because when we're talking about changing entire systems of how we have lived and operated for decades, it's expensive. The infrastructure is expensive, and the systemic changes that are needed to support all parts of the community are expensive. So it's good to kind of always bring it, I hate to say it, but bring it back to the budget and say, okay, these are all the great ideas we heard. Now what can we actually fit in? And town officials are very good about keeping track of everything that, Peter's good at anything he's noticed that we've either said, please look into this, or we looked excited about, will come back to us during budget season. And so I guess, like I said, the pro is getting all the big, compassionate, creative ideas, and the con is, when it comes to budget season, something might get put off, or something might be done less, in a lesser way than we wanted it to be. I could see both of those being a problem.
Perfectly well said about actually describing the cycle of the year of how we go through different phases of town government really consistently, from this first quarter of the year after town meeting, doing goal setting and farther more visionary kind of work, and then getting real practical by the time we're in the fall and the winter and getting down to what can we afford. But here's a really interesting outcome from these last couple of years. I don't think we have to speculate about what becoming a more compassionate community looks like. Not to say that we can't make greater strides than we have, but maybe in part, frankly, through the work of Compassionate Brattleboro and through our community's reflection on these very issues in these last couple of years, or maybe just sign of the times in terms of us doing what we can to invest in each other and in our community when we don't always see that sort of action going on outside of in other levels of government. But for whatever reason, the outcome these past 2 years has been different than pretty much every other year I know of in this community and in others. The budget that the staff has proposed to the select board has been increased by the select board before it went to the town meeting. And the town meeting increased that budget further before it finished adopting a budget. So I think that we're seeing compassionate action and community investment, a willingness to spend more money to address the things that are our community's priorities in the actual budgetary process. And when you think about, particularly at the town meeting level, things have been, frankly, more complicated, not necessarily different, not reflecting values in a different way, just much more complicated, because between staff and the select board, we dig way deeper into the weeds. But at the town meeting level, when you think about what those increases have been, these last 2 town meetings, it's been to make sure that the skate park gets built, a long, planned but not yet executed aspiration of the community to serve kids, to give kids a place to go and have an outlet in a way that has long been a good vision but hard to achieve. So we went and asked for $20,000 and town meeting said, here's 60. Let's go get this thing done, and we're close. It's not yet a shovel in the ground, but we're getting really close. The other, that and a sidewalk plow, because we haven't been doing an adequate job of keeping the sidewalks safe for people to walk in the winter. That's not just a Brattleboro is a beautiful town to walk around in issue. That's a very practical issue for people who have mobility issues, people who need to walk maybe because they don't have a car. So back to some of the economic aspects of this, having the sidewalks be safe and clear in the winter is a huge thing for us. And the community rose to that occasion and funded $140,000 to buy a sidewalk plow. So this past winter, the sidewalks were clearer and safer than they have been in recent years. And the other major area of investment, above and beyond what we have brought to them, and in this case, actually, we didn't make the recommendation, but we carried into the budget the recommendation of the town meeting's own Human Services Committee. But 2 years in a row, town meeting has increased funding from town government as contributions to the budgets of a variety of human service agencies that are providing basic needs support to the most vulnerable people in Brattleboro. I think we are living in an era of increasingly compassionate community engagement in Brattleboro, and it's exciting.
So, Chief, would a more compassionate community make your work easier or harder?
It would make it easier in the way of probably not what you're expecting, but hiring and retention of officers. The younger officers that I am interviewing today are so much more insightful to the community, the activities of the community, a sense of belonging to the community than full disclosure, than I ever was at 21 or 22. These officers truly want to be a part of something special. And go to a police department's website and look at some of the pictures posted on the website. That's going to probably tell you a lot about the philosophy, the vision, the goals, the mentality of that police department. If you pull up that police department and all you see is tactical vests and AR-16s and people in helmets, okay, you know what's important to that police department. If you go to other police departments and you see them at the park for bike day, if you see them having coffee with a cop, community forums like this, you know what's important to that police department. Because I'm going to put what's important to me on my website, because those are the type of people I want to attract to my department. So officers are going to go where they want to police in a style that they want to do. So having a compassionate community, that's where it greatly helps me, is when we do get those officers that come and they successfully complete a very rigorous and long background check, training. It's approximately 10 months from the time I talk to them, by the time they're in a cruiser going down Main Street by themselves. We have a lot of time, money vested in them, and I want them not only to be successful, but to work in a community where they're going to thrive and stay for a very long time. That's key right there, to stay. We can fill our ranks, but to fill our ranks with the right people, that takes some time. And I want a police department that looks downrange, that want to be a part of Brattleboro.
Thank you. So this is intended to be a community conversation. I think we've laid out some pretty good sense here, but let's have questions or comments or thoughts from you, the other parts of our community.
Should I walk around?
If you'd like.
I have a question. And part of it goes around a term I haven't heard. But I think is part of the continuum. I haven't heard the term sympathy. I've certainly heard empathy, and I've heard compassion. And it seems to me that the weekend of this continuum is sympathy, which many people feel. But sympathy comes at no cost. Empathy begins to open a crack toward cost, and compassion really involves cost. And I thought Brandy articulated this quite well. And I'm looking at the audience here, and I'm saying to myself, I guess compassion is something that's top down. I wonder how the other end feels it. What is it that the other end needs? And I understand it's a very complicated question, because if I don't want to be helped, and I'm going to stay in my pathway, how does one even consider bringing the idea of compassion into play? Because now it becomes a very difficult problem around laws, statutes, legal entities. This is very top down. I don't hear much about bottom up. And without knowing more about the bottom up, how the hell does one bring into play mechanisms, strategies, and tactics which begin to deal with the issue of, quote unquote, becoming a compassionate community?
I'm going to take that first.
So I, and some people, I don't want to say at the bottom, but to take your question as bottom up. I guess we're lucky, kind of, in the sense that not only have I lived at the bottom, but I also work every day and out of the drop-in center as the outreach case manager. And so I have a wonderful rapport with some of our most vulnerable citizens. And I bring that knowledge back to the select board. I bring that knowledge back to almost everybody that I speak to. I use it as an education point. I use it as a never using names, but here's something somebody I know is going through. Does that help you understand what you're struggling to understand? Can that help you feel the compassion I need you to feel to understand why I'm about to make this proposal? So whenever I speak, I'm always speaking from the bottom up. And I have the blessing and privilege to also bring those voices and make their voices be top down.
Yeah, I've seen you do it, Brandy.
The chief can speak to how this plays out for the police officers, but I'd like to make one comment about the police department and then talk about how that more broadly exists throughout town government. So one thing I know to be true is that the police officers know many of the folks who are spending a lot of time on the streets, know them by name and stop and talk and check in and how are you doing today? And part of your question was about readiness, to individuals' readiness to be helped. Something that was really hard for me to understand as we started to grapple more explicitly with these issues, but I've come to understand it much more clearly, is the degree to which not everybody is ready in the same way at the same time for the same reasons. And so the police officers, particularly because of their sort of frontline role for town government, are playing a really important role in understanding that not everybody's ready to receive the help that we might want to give at any particular time. And that's life, that's okay, that's being human. And part of why it's so important for us to be defining boundaries of acceptance differently than maybe what we want or would like, but rather understanding that if somebody is making somebody uncomfortable and threatening them or causing them harm, police will intervene in a way that removes the person. But if somebody's just there struggling and not doing other people harm, we're just not going to do that. We're going to instead continue to provide support. Some days it's only emotional support. Some days they're able to accept something that's a bit more active support from us. That manifests itself in other ways now as we've worked more broadly as a team to find ways in which other aspects of town government can provide that same kind of support. Star, if you would take a minute and talk for us about some things that have been going on in the library. I think people may not, we as a community, I know, value these kinds of moments. We come together as a community here in ways that are different and richer than we used to. But directly on point with this issue about service to those who are struggling, the library's actually been doing quite a lot lately.
Well, thank you, Peter. And it's thanks to the support of town administration and the select board that we've been able to really do some wonderful things. I will say that one of the things that drew me to this position was when I went on and researched the library policies here. I was so impressed that one of the goals of the strategic plan was to provide a welcoming environment for all. And then I dug a little deeper and I saw that they have a very reasonable behavior code and that it's behavior that's addressed. It's not the individuals, it's the behavior. So if anybody causes a disturbance or creates a situation where if someone feels unsafe in the library, that behavior is addressed, but not specific individuals, as a personality. The other thing, and this is really unusual, but we do not have a rule against sleeping in this library. Most libraries do, but we do allow sleeping in this library because we know that that can be brought on by any number of things. We can have had grandparents bring their grandchildren up to the children's room and, nod off a little bit. We've had board members, reading a magazine over here and, just nod off a little bit. And then we have people that we know have spent the night on the street and just need a place to put their stuff down and feel safe and feel warm and close their eyes. And also this staff is remarkably compassionate. One of the things that a staff member proposed last winter, and we did again this winter, was to buy hand and foot warmers for some of our patrons that we knew were spending a lot of time outside. And people came to rely on that, and they come in and get them when they know that there's going to be an especially cold night and they're going to be outside. So the staff is always looking at ways to serve all the community. And then we have this great board who is not only supportive, but proactively take the initiative to serve all members of the community. And as Brandy said, fair is not always equal. And but one of the things they recognized was that fines put an undue, they disproportionately affect people with limited financial resources. And so I'm so happy to say that with the support of the board and really with their momentum and then the support of the select board and town administration, this library no longer charges overdue fines. So we've had many wonderful anecdotes of families that people have overheard as they're leaving. One staff member just told me last week, he saw a family leaving and the kids were so excited to have books and they said, oh, the library's great and we can come back because now there are no fines, and so that makes it worth it. Really, what's the greater cost? Trying to collect that $10 in fines or having a family that feels they can't use the library. So I'm so proud of our board and our town to support that. So they realized they needed to put their money where their mouth was. That's what budget decisions are all about, or put their money where their value is. And so our board took on some of the other expenses that the town had previously done. And thanks to Mr. Reed and our wonderful endowment, we were able to give that service, a uniform service to all the folks at Brattleboro. So I'm very thrilled with that. And then we just changed some practices. We now recognize the drop-in center as an official address so that people who do not have a permanent address can get a piece of mail sent to them at the drop-in center, and we'll issue them a card so that they can check something out and take it with them so that they can read it and enjoy it. So those are just some of the things. And if other people have other ideas, please let me know.
As a comparative newcomer, I've only been here 15 years. Would like to say, and I live in Dummerston, but I'm planning to be down here next year. I would like to say how impressed I am with your attitude towards fixing things rather than punishing things. I think that is so beautiful and makes so much more sense. It just amazes me that you think that way and are looking and realize that everybody's different, that every case is different, that you just can't say, all right, this person did this, we're going to do this with him. But looking at each case as an individual thing, I think that is an amazing thing to see in a town. I have one complaint. When you clear the sidewalks of the snow, you kind of clear the place between where the sidewalk ends and the road begins, because if you're my age and you're partially crippled and you have to step off the sidewalk, sometimes you're really, if there isn't, you have to walk a long way to find a place where you can get down to your car. So, which is just silly. But the other thing is very important to me, that to realize that there is a government that thinks how to work in a peaceful way and get things better, not just punish it.
Thanks a lot. This has been eye-opening. I have kind of comment, an observation, and a question. The comment kind of relates to the top-down. I would like to suggest that there isn't an us or them or winners or losers, but we're all in this thing together. And as human beings, we're all suffering, maybe to a greater or lesser degree. And I think sometimes that sense of us and them comes from the sense of being separate from other people. Secondly, an observation on yesterday, walking to one of those locations. And at the location, I saw a number of people who were having a good time, actively drug using, actively drinking in public, and then across the street at the co-op was everybody else trying to ignore them and act like they weren't there. And so I would really like to kind of figure out how to kind of bridge that gap, because that gap is really huge in this town. And again, we're all in this together. And then the question is to talk about how you work with the losers around the 1% tax compassionately. So we'll just leave it at that. And
So, Chief, let's maybe start with the first comment there on, in that particular situation, how would you hope a police officer would respond, and what is most important?
Sure. First of all, once again, criminal activity is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. So if you witness criminal activity, please call the police department, and we most certainly will respond and go down there. And secondly, you have to understand that everybody enjoys the protection of constitutional rights, okay? What you saw may have been a drug deal, or it may not have been a drug deal. So when we go and talk to these group of people while we're down there, we have to be very cognizant of their constitutional rights. So we will go down there and we will talk to them. More times than not, we have a very good understanding of who they are. If I could go back about 2 minutes ago, when before Star spoke, is we have made it a point to meet a lot of people in places where it is non-confrontational, non-traditional law enforcement, and basically just to get to know them as a person. So we will go to these various organizations and just walk in and sit down and have a soda with them, a glass of water, a cup of coffee, and just talk with them. Get to know their name. Because as you can imagine, if that didn't happen, and it didn't for a very long time, the frustration on the part of the officer of constantly interacting with the same individual over and over again, what I wanted to do was change the smack of the lip, the roll of the eyes, not you again, okay, to an atmosphere of, Jim, how are you doing? You were doing so well. 10 days. All right, buddy, come on, what do you need? Let's take care of this. Next time, let's shoot for 12 days. That's the attitude I want the officers to go when we hit instances like you were just describing. It took a while. It took several years, and now it's part of our DNA at the police department. When people come off of their training from the academy, they go through 12 weeks of field training here in town with a specially trained officer, and that specially trained officer will take them to these various organizations, these various places, walk in, introduce them, just like they would to all the merchants up and down Main Street, okay? And this officer now, right from the very beginning, understands how we're going to police in this town, how we're going to treat every citizen within this town. If some of you remember, probably 2 years ago, there was a huge uproar about individuals hanging out downtown. The police response to that was Project Care. And basically what Project Care has nothing really to do with homelessness, but it has a lot to do with addressing the opiate epidemic that is just ravaging towns and cities from coast to coast. And where people are struggling the most are small to mid rural towns and cities that do not have the huge resources of the larger metropolitan areas. So we came up with an idea, and we used the Perry model. And basically what we did is we reached out. We're not social workers, okay? I'm not a recovery coach, but I knew something needed to be done. So we reached out to all the subject matter experts. We went to the retreat, we went to the Habit Opco, we went to BMH, Groundworks, Turning Point, and I know I'm forgetting BUHS, because we wanted an educational preventive component involved in this. But anyway, we got 6 to 8 organizations that came together, and we now proactively go out into the communities and talk to people who are suffering from substance misuse. And if you OD'd on Tuesday night, you're probably going to get a visit within 36 to 48 hours from members of our team. Now, once again, this is not a cop knocking on your door looking for information. Sometimes an officer may be with that group, sometimes they will not, but it's made up of recovery coaches, people from groundworks, all the different organizations, the police department, and they basically just knock and say, hey, you got a minute? What's going on? What can we do for you? What do you need? And it started off very slow. My saying was, we moved at the speed of trust. Because you can imagine, when we knock on the door, it's like, nope, I'm all set, I got nothing to say to you, I'm all right, okay? And I wanted to make sure that when an individual reached out for help, that we were able to get them help, because word would spread so fast. If they said, you know what, cops, I went up there, I went to the PD, I asked for help, and they did nothing. It's a waste of time, don't even worry about it. So we had to in place everything, or get everything in place. So if someone did say yes, we had to make liaison with treatment facilities, arrange for transportation. Now mind you, everything that I'm talking about was done 100% volunteers for members of the community and the organizations. There's no budget for this. This was done because people were doing the right thing and they saw a need. That's what this community is all about. So we reach out, we do proactive work. So even if we go down to places where an individual feels uncomfortable, they see criminal activity, that goes back to what I stated earlier. You will never hear these words out of the police department while I'm your chief. There's nothing we can do. You will never hear those words from me, okay? Because there's always something I can do. I may not fix the problem, I may not make it go away, you may not be happy, but I'm going to do something. I'm going to talk to the individual, I'm going to find somebody who's a subject matter expert in that area, I'm going to solicit their advice, I'm going to get resources. So we are very, very proactive in areas like that.
With a short question about the 1%,
Yes.
what happens?
Yep. So I think that's a really excellent example of a decision that was binary, right? There was a decision that had to be made of whether there was going to be a 1 cent local option. For those who may not have known exactly what that was, it's the state offers very limited alternatives to the property tax to local governments, but one of the alternatives is a community can decide to have, instead of the 6% state tax, have a 7% sales tax within the community, where the extra 1 cent gets collected by the state and 2/3 of it gets remitted back to the municipality where it was collected. There wasn't an ability to make that a more complicated question about, you know, doing something that might have felt better to a broader cross-section. It was either going to be a majority of people were for having the 1 cent local option sales tax, or a majority of people who were against it. But in the run-up to it, and in the fullness of the discussion at town meeting, there was nobody who wanted to participate in that conversation who was excluded from it. And so people from the business community and people on different, representing different segments of the community or perspectives from their own experiences in the community, there was a lot of variation of opinion that was shared. In the end, on a relatively close vote, it was approved. And so beginning in July, we will have an extra penny on the sales tax in Brattleboro. And 2/3 of that revenue is going to come back to the town, which is expected to be somewhat in excess of $600,000 a year. And so in the course of the town meeting, you know, part of the generosity that we talked about earlier in this conversation was driven by that decision earlier in the meeting to impose this tax and collect that revenue. There was a feeling that there was kind of a surplus that, you know, some of which could be invested in some of the priorities of the community that were not yet being met through the budget that was in front of the body. And then there was a very strong sense from, I think, most of the people who voted for it, and still is true in the implementation of it, that the vast majority of that $600,000, over $500,000 of it, is intended to reduce the property tax burden, which is extremely high in Brattleboro because we have such limited alternatives. That's a situation where we know there are people in the community who felt like they fought for a position and lost. We hope that in the fullness of time that some of the concerns that caused people to oppose the 1 cent local option sales tax will prove to be, not have the negative impact that some people are concerned it might have. There's alternative points of view, and none of us know exactly how it's going to turn out yet. So we'll all have to live through that together and keep an eye on whether there are any negative impacts to the business community, whether there are people in the community who whose financial hardship is actually exacerbated by having to pay a little extra sales tax. These are reasonable concerns that we all need to pay attention to as we see how the implementation actually turns out.
If I may, I do have a question. I think perhaps rightfully so, it's all right and good that much of the discussion regarding compassion has been anthropocentric. It's focusing on human beings. I do think it's important to mention that we can also have compassion for the environment, for God's creation, for the earth. And I think that is one of the wonderful things about our community in Brattleboro, is that there is that compassion. I can promise you, one of the reasons why I came to Brattleboro was because there was a supercharger at Market 32 at Price Chopper. That's actually one of the reasons why I decided to come to Brattleboro. And one of the reasons why I decided to live downtown is because there is EV capabilities at the garage. But I have noticed that there's a lot of commuters using the EV, and there are only 2 chargers where there are 4 bays. So while the town manager and also a select board member is here, I just thought I would propose that those EV capabilities are being used. Those 2 usable bays are often filled, when 4 actually could be utilized on a regular basis. So I just wanted to introduce that there is compassion for the environment and for the earth as well as for people. And maybe just a small commercial, at the Center Congregational Church, we're doing a sermon series for 4 weeks on the environment and on creation. I think Jim had a question.
Before we go to Jim's question, we'll look into the 2 bays that aren't served. I'm not sure what that's about, but we'll check that out tomorrow. We'll find out.
It's just there are 4 EV bays, but
Yes.
only 2 chargers.
2 at a time.
For those
Okay.
4 bays.
So the one thing I wanted to point out is that for other people, if you go there and it's not available, there are also 2 chargers in the High Grove lot here in downtown. So there are also a scattered set of chargers around in other locations around town, but without leaving downtown, you could go to the High Grove lot and catch one there.
Maybe put a sign up that said
Woman,
that.
you had a question?
I do, I can wait if you have one.
Woman in red?
Yeah, there's signage at the locations where they are. I don't believe there's remote signage to point people
If a
there.
stranger is in town, and they see this, and they don't know where,
Right.
Aren't there apps for that?
Yes, there are.
Yeah,
everybody
I
has-
suspect there are. We'll
not
look
everybody
into
has
how we can
apps
make
at
that more
work.
widely known.
If you live in Dummerston, you don't have anything, you can get an app from Cleveland.
I was interested to know how we're making our churches feel safe right now, or teachers even.
So the question is how we are making our churches feel safe?
Yeah.
Is that something that the town has a role in?
Well, the police department sure does. We're constantly...
You're talking about like mass shooting type situations? Okay.
We're constantly talking with people of the interfaith communities, constantly. I mean, like weekly. Same way with the schools, all the different schools, the elementary schools, the middle schools, and the high schools. And we basically do what we're doing here. We'll hear all their concerns. Obviously I'm not gonna get into a whole bunch of tactics and things of that nature, but we're extra vigilant at times that we need to be. Sometimes the people from the religious side will ask us to be present but not visible, you know, so we have certainly accommodated that. Other times they would like for us to just basically do a drive-by, so, you know, people of their congregation could see, and sometimes they want us in the parking lot. And, you know, we accommodate that because we understand the times we live in, and there's a true fear out there, a very viable true fear, and you know, we live in bad times. So we're constantly in communications with everybody, and same with the other first responders within the town. We constantly train with rescue and fire and police, not only with just the Brattleboro Police Department, but with Windham County, Vermont State Police. We have MOUs with Chesterfield and Hinsdale, so they'll come over and participate in our trainings too. So it's something we take very seriously, and it's always at the front of our radar.
Thank you. I have a question for the police chief. I live off of Putney Road, and you folks I know are very busy. I hear the sirens all the time, and I worry about the people in your department and the possibility of burnout, and what kinds of things do you do to help them through that? Because again, you do want to keep them for a long time, and your work is difficult.
Yeah, thank you. That is, as a law enforcement executive, that's probably one of my #1 jobs, is to sit there and watch, because they do see a lot of things that people shouldn't see. They experience a lot of things that people shouldn't experience. And we're not talking, you don't have to be 20 years on the force to experience that. So we constantly meet with them monthly. We do monthly sits down, and during that is, you know, pretty much how are you doing? And there's a lot of signs that certainly do not go unnoticed, or do we just gloss over. We watch their productivity level, their motivation level. Are they coming in late? Are they going home early? Are they calling in sick a lot? How are their reports? How was their proactive policing? Things that they were very, very excited about. Now, do they even care anymore? You know, have they lost that inner fire? So we sit down with every officer every month and basically go through their activity for the month. And it's not a counseling session. I'd hate to say it like that. It's more of a let's touch base and get the feel of it. We ask them how the department is doing, how do they feel about the department, what is their job satisfaction, and you know, what could we do? We ask them what they are interested in, what schools can we send them to, what trainings can we send them to, and then we also have a social worker on staff. So we have pretty good access, and then of course we have EAP that we have referred people to. But we keep a close eye on them, and thank you very much for your concern, because it's one of my top priorities also.
I've got a question. I've got a question for the chief, and then one for the group. I imagine that in your work, you sometimes have to deal with governmental entities beyond the town. Sometimes the county, sometimes the state, maybe even more. I imagine maybe trafficking is one of the examples. And I imagine you might not always encounter the kind of compassion that you find in the town government, and I'd be curious to know what you do about it. And the question for the rest of you, I was so interested when you talked about this cycle of you think big, you think out of the box, and then the other part of the cycle is you bring it back to the budget. I mean, that's perfectly stated. Now, what would happen if the Gates Foundation decided we're going to do something special with Brattleboro and just provide you with a ton of money to do compassionate things, step back for a moment from your job, become citizens again, but with all your experience, and tell me one thing that you would then put on the agenda for this kind of funding.
One.
I got
Want me to go first? Okay, my part of the question is, what are some of the barriers and obstacles that I deal with at the state and federal level that maybe don't share the same philosophy and vision that I do? It's difficult. We have just recently received our Justice Assistant Grant, our JAG grant. That was applied for and approved in 2017. And I don't know officially why it was held up, but very suspiciously, a lot of people that have the same compassion, vision, and philosophy didn't receive their money from the federal government either. But we did finally get it, and it was, a long, hard-fought battle. What's good about that is we have individuals that, like Senator Leahy's office was instrumental, very helpful. We'd call them as often as we wanted and still do. And when, we see things that we vehemently disagree with, we talk to them, and sometimes there's things they can do about it. And just like you, we're no different. We get mandated to do something, we get mandated to do something. I certainly don't agree with everything that comes out of the legislature, and I imagine nobody in here does either. But sometimes the only thing that I really get upset about is, and I won't get on a soapbox, unfunded mandates. That really bothers me. If you mandate that I do something, then give me the resources and the money for me to do it. Just don't say do it, period, and walk away. And then, I got 27 officers that I have to somehow get to this school, get this certification out of a budget that's already been approved. They did not have that money put in for it. So, but other than that, we do work very well with state and federal, our representatives, and have a very good communications.
Okay, so you said I get to step out and be a citizen, because what I'm going to say may not be reflective of the government that I work in or the organization that I work for. So this is my own thing. I would take some money and I would open a comprehensive 12 to 24 month opiate recovery campus that would start, well, I'm just going to say it. People can feel how they feel. It would start with supervised injection site on one part of the campus. It would be staffed with case managers and nurses. There would be different buildings of kind of group home type places as you move through the steps. And then when you move to the other side of the campus, it would be much like Great River Terrace, where there would be small housing. You would be there for a year at that very part of it, still under case management, still with help, and then the voucher would turn into a housing choice voucher after that year. I am often so thoroughly disappointed with the kind of recovery centers that we have in this state that take people in for 21 days and then put them often right back out on the street where they can remain on housing lists for 12 to 24 months, homeless again, not sure why they would feel like staying sober at that point, frankly. And contrary to the sound bites that we all ingested from Commissioner Tom Anderson, I believe his name is that correct? There is not on-demand recovery service for opiate addiction. You cannot just walk into a place when you feel like you need to recover. I've had people walk into my office ready to go that second, and there wasn't a bed ready at Valley Vista for 5 weeks. Even some of our local outpatient places in the last couple weeks have had at least 1 week waiting periods. The way that we handle this is abominable. We toss them in for a mere 3 weeks, and then we expect their behavior to be perfect while they come back out and sleep in a pricker bush. That's what I would do with my money, is I would change that system.
Maybe we have time for one or two more. Right?
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate learning a lot about what you're doing. I'm a retired teacher, and I like your idea. I'm a very firm believer in the hierarchy of needs. And when you're at the bottom and you don't have even the basic needs, such as a safe place to be and a place to put your things and a little sense of security, it just makes a huge difference in everything in your life. So I'm hoping that over time it will be possible for us to house more people. I've been reading articles, Springfield and Holyoke, Amherst, Utah, Bergen County, New Jersey, many of these places are using this homes first model, and getting people into, not involuntarily, it's voluntarily, but offering them sometimes a group situation, but housing. And then all the other services are also supplied. And that benefits not just them, but the whole community, the whole area, because we're only as strong as our weakest, most vulnerable people. And it's to the advantage of all of us, I think, to support everyone's needs, and that includes these people. I have a friend who's been in the Coalition for Affordable Housing up in Burlington, and I asked him what they do for shelters, and he said, actually, we're putting most of our effort into permanent housing and not shelters so much anymore. So I hope we'll do something about that in our town. And I think it would also help solve the problems that some of the business people feel. It's unsightly to have so many people advertising they don't have housing. Well, if they have housing, then not all of those people will need to be on the street asking for a place to live.
Thank you. The Housing First model is actually something that has begun to be used, but clearly there's not enough capacity at this point to meet the need. But Brandy mentioned Great River Terrace, and that was the idea behind Great River Terrace, is to provide a small, safe place for people to live on a campus where there's some support services being provided, and there's aspirations among the different groups in the community to work together to create more of that. We need quite a lot more of it.
So as a closing question, the three of you have a great deal of experience with the Brattleboro community. You see it from many different standpoints. The mission of Compassionate Brattleboro is to help Brattleboro be a more compassionate place. Given that Jim's windfall is not likely to come, given what we have to work with, what do you think are the ripest opportunities we have, or what would help us be a more compassionate community?
My answer will probably be the shortest, so I'll kick off real easy. I really enjoy community forums like this. So education, you're always going to have opposing views. There's always going to be strife, if you will, amongst people within the town. Just like with the panhandling situation. There's some people that feel very, very strongly that panhandling should not be allowed whatsoever. And there's other groups that feel just as strongly that it is a protected constitutional right. And, so education, I think, is key. And what I mean by that is just informing people and having open forums like this. And it's incumbent upon town government to, whenever we can get that message out, that we need to do whatever we can to do it. Because simply it makes my job easier. So why wouldn't I want to do it? You know, so I think that's it. We got to just keep this train going forward. Just keep the momentum.
That's what I was going to say, actually. I was going to tease the chief and say, for the first time that I can remember, I'm actually going to be briefer than you. You said you were going to be shortest, but stay the course. For the reasons I described earlier, and I think it was also reflected in many of the comments as we had the conversation together, Brattleboro is an amazingly compassionate community. We have become more intentionally compassionate over these last few years. But you know, we've got it going here. Both inside the government and out more broadly in the community. And we need to keep going. It doesn't mean we're going to get everything right. It doesn't mean that there aren't people in the community who are going to think our priorities in the wrong place. We need to keep having those conversations. We need to keep all being part of it. Again, you know, the compassion part, I guess actually, that's a stay the course was short. You know, it strikes me that as our priorities have so visibly shifted over these last few years, where we've been so consciously making sure that voices that previously weren't heard get heard, that there are some people in the community who didn't used to have any trouble at all getting their voices heard, who are now wondering what's become of Brattleboro. And suggest to those folks, stay in the conversation with us, because we think that we're working together to strengthen the community and to be a better place together. And we all, you know, this is a predominantly very compassionate, you know, a group of people in this room that I think came here to hear this conversation and participate in this conversation in a way that you thought would resonate, and it seems from our body language that we're all feeling pretty good about the direction we're headed in. We all need to exercise that. Our compassionate perspective on the world, our desire to be in community with others, to make sure that we're continuing to listen to the folks who feel uncomfortable walking down Elliott Street. We're not going to change our tactics to marginalize people, but you know, there are people in our community who have a different perspective, and you know, the thing that I think we just need to be relentless about is staying in community with one another and working through those issues. If we keep doing that, we will find ways over and over again to work together and feel good about where we're headed. There will be times when the choice is more binary and there are people who feel like they didn't get what they thought was better for the community, and in those moments we all need to be adults and keep moving. But I think just walking the walk of being a compassionate community together will keep us moving in the right direction.
I agree with the stay the course idea. There are groups like Compassionate Brattleboro. There is a group that seeks to build bridges between different segments of our town called the Concentric Circles. I believe it's still called that. I think they're up for a new name. If anybody has an idea, I'm pretty sure I've heard that a few times. But you know, where it takes people who are, some who are flying a sign and some who are business owners, and I think there's law enforcement and case managers and all different kinds of people that meet once or twice a month and work to have conversations and come up with ideas and to help facilitate more conversations between people who may not inherently understand each other. I think we need to, on the human side, we need to be kind. Be kind to people who have lived a life where seeing, you know, rowdy behavior on the street scares them. Be kind. Because if you can't be kind, they're not going to listen to you when it matters. Be empathetic. Be empathetic with each other. Be empathetic with people who are struggling. And hold space to hear the conversation from both sides, even when it can really be hard to do it. Do it anyways. Try not to talk at people. Try not to tell people why how they feel is wrong. It won't get you anywhere. On the business side, the governmental business side, we bring it back to what are our policies? Do we need to be reviewing? Are any of our policies outdated? Do they need to be revised? How does our town plan really reflect each segment of the population? Do we need to update that, which we do? Are we updating it to talk about housing? Are we updating it to talk about more environmental protection and bike lanes? And how are we really growing as this community grows and evolves? And really, it's always going to be education. And the best way to educate people is to hear them. The best way that I tell people, who don't want to be approached, I say, the next time somebody approaches you on the street and asks you for money, ask them their name and what they're struggling with today. And then the next day that you see them, ask them how they did with that issue they were struggling with. Because just as some people find people who are struggling on the streets as less human, so might the people who are used to being stepped on by other parts of society. So when you outreach and you ask questions, you ask a name, and then you follow up on the challenge, all of a sudden you're both human to each other, and the conversation flows. And instead of it's that person in the corner, it's Joey, and you know that he's having an issue with DCF, and you actually had a question about that, or you had an idea, or you had a resource, and you bump into him again, and instead of feeling awkward, you're like, oh, Joey, how did that go? Because I was just thinking, I was talking to my friend Nancy. Now we're all humans, right? And then we can start saying, maybe don't hang out in front of there, or maybe, come and talk to me about doing this. Humanize each other. All of this should be done even if we get that windfall that Jim promised me on TV, which you all heard.
Thank you. Before we thank our panelists, I want to thank you, Chief, for the encouragement to keep it going. At the Compassionate Brattleboro meeting last week, we decided that it would make sense to continue these conversations next fall. Exactly what they're going to look like hasn't been decided yet. If you'd like to be part of that process, leave your contact information on the sign-up sheet, and you can be part of helping the community be more compassionate. 2 weeks from today, in this space, this series will continue with compassion in our public schools. It's going to be a very rich presentation on all of the elementary schools, the high schools, and the general supervisory union policies, both in how the schools embody compassion and how they teach compassion, of what is the process by which people grow in compassion, and what role can the school play in having that happen. So that's going to be a very rich discussion. And on May 22nd,
will students be part of the panel?
No. Good question. On May 22nd, Compassion and Healing, which is how compassion plays out in our healthcare system, and as we deal with each other through health issues. So please come back, and thank you, panelists, very much.
And Doug, May 3rd,
Jim wants me to announce that one of the other things that Compassionate Brattleboro is doing is we have an annual Unsung Hero Award, which is finding actions in the community that aren't well enough known and bringing them to public attention. The award for this year is going to volunteers in Brattleboro, Marlborough, and Putney, who are housing asylum seekers in the area. One of the issues about being unsung is that often this has to be done somewhat secretively because of the security needs of the people who are being served. So this will be on Friday the 3rd, that's Gallery Walk, at 6 o'clock in the River Garden. So, and you'll have an opportunity to sing if you want to sing to the unsung. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.